I've not given my schedule, but yes. Is everyone ready? I care about TV, deeply care about TV. Don't take it personally. All right, why don't we get started? This is the press conference that I have before our legislative meetings tomorrow, March 7th. We will have a legislative meeting. It will be preceded by a committee of the whole. The committee of the whole will meet at 11 o'clock. We're trying to meet an hour earlier this council period, and then the legislative meeting will follow. The committee of the whole is marking up 5 bills. 2 of them are closing of portions of street or alley. Actually, 3 of them. One of the, probably the one that's most significant is we're moving forward legislation with regard to revising the law with regard to street vendors and street vending, clarifying and reducing penalties. It's civil enforcement with regard to vending infractions, and there'll be a better system for monitoring street vendors. There's been some controversy about street vendors, particularly in Columbia Heights. This bill addresses all of that. That's probably the most significant measure that's coming out of the committee of the whole. That will be followed by the legislative meeting. It's still early in the council period, and everyone is getting ready for the budget, which will come to us on March 22nd. There are a number of emergency bills. The permanent bills that are on the agenda either are a final reading, so already went through first reading, or they're the bills that are coming out of the committee of the whole. So I don't know that there'll be a lot of attention around that. I think you all have copies of the agenda, so if you have questions, please feel free to ask. The emergency bills, the use of force review board emergency bill from Councilmember Pinto is to simply put in place now flexibility for the chief of police to make appointments from within MPD to the use of force review board. The reverse mortgage insurance and tax payment program extension is simply continuing the status quo with a program for which we provided funding and ensuring that that funding is still available until expended. Certificate of assurance moratorium is simply extending a moratorium we put in place a couple of years ago. The comprehensive policing and justice reform emergency from Councilmember Allen is simply continuing what we adopted in December, waiting for the permanent to become law. I would argue probably the most significant part of that bill is the measure that prohibits the police from bargaining their own disciplinary process. The Commission on Arts and Humanities is to simply give authority to the Commission on Arts and Humanities to appoint their new executive director in an acting capacity. As an independent agency, doesn't have that authority. And fidelity and access to government communications, you should all care deeply about. It's actually continuing a bill that we adopted a couple of years ago to make clear that doesn't matter what platform government officials may be using for social media accounts or communication within the government, it has to be kept retained so that it's FOIA-able. And the motor vehicle and homeowner insurance emergency, which is Councilmember McDuffie's moving at the request of the mayor, is actually a consumer protection measure. The insurance commissioner notes that some insurance companies have been raising policies by 10, 20%. And this is to change the way that those rate increases can go into effect. Changing it from, I forget the exact terminology, something like implement and then review to a prior approval first. See if I can find that. I can't. And also to ensure that if the increase is over 10%, that those who have the policies have to be given, I think it's 60 days notice. So that's a consumer protection measure. Those are the highlights from the legislative meeting. I want to touch on a couple of issues. Just check my notes here. This morning, I delivered a letter to the Senate withdrawing the Criminal Code Reform Commission legislation. It's clear that Congress is intending to override that legislation. And so my letter, just as I transmit bills for their review, withdraws from consideration the review. I note in the letter, it's a brief letter, that since the Senate has not taken action on the legislation, the withdrawal means that it is no longer properly before the Congress, since the Home Rule Act requires that it's transmitted to both houses, and that it will, in order to become law, it will have to be retransmitted to both houses of Congress for the required congressional review. I'm quite clear in my letter that pulling it back means that the clock stops, and it would have to be retransmitted to both houses, and that this will enable the council to work on the measure in light of congressional comments and to retransmit it later. So I will say I don't know that that will stop the Senate Republicans, but our position is that the bill is not before Congress any longer. I also want to note that the other bill regarding expanding voting, the right to vote in the district, that became law a couple of weeks ago. And I've learned a lot in the last couple of weeks that for reasons that are outside the law, apparently at least one of the houses count stays differently than what the law prescribes, which is that the count starts on the day we transmit. And we transmitted that legislation January 10th. So it's already become law. That's the other bill, the voting bill. I think those are the issues I wanted to cover. Mr. Sherwood?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've withdrawn, you've asked the Senate to give you the bill back. Assume that's an automatic thing. But what do you anticipate going forward is next in terms of revising that bill to make it more acceptable to the Congress, whether you like doing that or not?
I think that members are going to have to talk and get a sense of what our next step is. I agree with the comment that was made, I think, on your show last Friday, that if we were to send the bill back up tomorrow, changing the issues that have been complained of, there would be other issues that would be brought up that have not been brought up yet. So I think just pulling it back and assessing what the next step is and looking at some of the issues, explaining better what the legislation does and does not do. So that will take some time. I don't foresee that there will be a quick retransmittal.
On CNBC this morning, Speaker McCarthy said he couldn't believe that the DC Council had decriminalized carjacking. Of course, you didn't do that.
Correct.
But that's the kind of political headwinds you're facing.
Correct. I've said this before. You know, crime lends itself easily to demagogic rhetoric. And there's nothing about the legislation that decriminalizes carjacking. The fact of the matter is that the revised criminal code maintains carjacking as a separate offense. Most of the states do not even have a specific offense for carjacking. And what the revised criminal code does with regard to carjacking is to have a maximum penalty that, if I remember correctly, is about 10 years longer than what the typical sentence is for armed carjacking. But that is the challenge, is the messaging. It's quite clear to me that the headwinds that have prevailed in Congress are about the politics of next year's election and not about what's the substance in this criminal code. The fact is that the criminal code has hit these headwinds, which is why I pulled it back.
If I could just complete my questions on this issue. There are some suggestions that other bent measures may be subject to the House Republicans, who of course would take home rule back itself, but the reform measures that the council passed in December, the police matters that you Have you been told of any other bills that are in target by the House Republican?
No, there's been some speculation within the council, primarily by staff, but no, I've not been informed of anything from Congress. But your question doesn't surprise me. I think that, I mean, part of the reason for my pulling back the bill to untransmit it is that we need to calm things down. And there has been over the last year some comments from some of the more strident Republicans. And, you know, I hate to put this in partisan terms, but it clearly is about getting rid of home rule or having hearings. I had heard that could be a hearing on the integrity of our elections, which nobody has questioned. I don't know if that's just rumor, but I expect that there could be more trouble, and I'd like to back things off so that things can calm down and maybe there'll be less of that mischief making.
Thank you.
Michael.
Considering the miscommunication around disagreement on when the voting rights legislation became law, do you anticipate the Senate will respect the fact that the council is withdrawing this bill and not attempt to move further on it?
Well, I think, I don't know what to expect. I think that the Republicans, and again, I hate to put this in partisan terms, but it's so clearly been the Republicans who've been leading this. And it's not about the criminal code. You know, when there are comments such as that we're decriminalizing a crime that we're not decriminalizing. So I don't know exactly what to expect, but if the Republicans want to proceed with a vote, it will be a hollow vote because the bill isn't there before them.
And so do you have the ability to pull a bill that's been submitted to Congress yourself? Do you need anyone else from the council to weigh in on that? How exactly does that work?
Well, I transmit, the Home Rule Act is very clear that the chairman of the council transmits. There is not a prohibition in the law with regard to my pulling it back. The purpose of the transmittal is so that before a bill becomes law, Congress has an opportunity to weigh in. It's quite clear at this point that both houses would vote against the legislation. So in effect, we're accomplishing what they want, which is that bill cannot become law. But in the typical fashion of legislating, when one sees they don't have the votes, they pull a measure back. Yes, sir. Behind you, Martin.
In terms of revisiting the bill, what sense are you getting about as far as who's accepting the substance of it, you know, whether it be advocacy groups versus regular Washingtonians who may not be as in touch with council happenings?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but let me answer this way. And if I get it wrong, follow up. And that is that I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation around the criminal code reform bill. And it's because of the rhetoric that's taken place. So for example, the rhetoric that it makes the city less safe. We know from stacks and stacks of research that sentencing, the length of sentences does not in itself have a deterrent effect on crime. And yet folks talk about sentencing as if it does. And that's not to say that sentencing isn't important, because it is. But in terms of making the city less safe, or the rhetoric around how there's a city right now is experiencing a lot of crime and that this is the wrong time to be changing the criminal code, except the criminal code doesn't become effective by its own terms for a couple of years. So whatever we think of today, the criminal code has no effect on that. But the council made changes to what the Reform Commission had recommended in response to a lot of comments from the public, the chief, the U.S. attorney, and so forth. And I say that because I would argue, strengthened the legislation, but even what the commission had recommended, in every instance, they looked carefully at what judges were actually sentencing folks. So just to put it hypothetically, if the maximum under the current law is, let's say, 40 years, and judges were typically sentencing 15 years, what the Criminal Code Revision Commission recommended was something maybe less than 40 years, but more than what judges were handing out. And that's true in instance after instance after instance, that the maximums in the bill are greater than what judges were actually handing out. But that's not what people were hearing. What people were hearing was we were decriminalizing, or that we were reducing sentences. The messaging just got out of our control.
All right. So with that being said, what efforts will be made to get more in touch with actual Washingtonians, people who are not sitting in nonprofits, regular 9-to-5 Washingtonians who are in the trenches of Ward 7 and 8?
Fair question. So I indicated before, it's not my intent or expectation that the council is going to turn this bill around in the next week or month or so. I think the Judiciary Committee is going to have to step back, assess the bill and the rhetoric and where we are, and work out a timetable. But we need to better message so that folks understand what this bill is doing. And I would say that messaging would come in two forms. One is more clearly with regard to violent crimes, or what the current sentencing practices are and what the bill proposes. And also separately, but relatedly, to do a comparison with other states. So just to use carjacking, for example, we've looked at other states. Some of the states that our fiercest critics come from have either don't have the crime of carjacking, or they have a maximum that's like half of what this bill proposes. So we need to do better in comparing this bill with other states, which reminds me of one other point, and that is generally our current criminal code is considered one of the worst in the country. A lot of archaic provisions and not as much clarity as is expected in the criminal procedure these days. Really not modeled on best practices that other states are following. For instance, differentiating in the code different degrees of severity with penalties. So that's our current code. It's lacking. It's considered one of the worst in the country, and it's unfortunate that we have to step back to that. Let me get someone who hasn't.
Clarify something you said. You said that you have sent a letter to the Senate
Yes.
withdrawing the bill.
Yes.
Is there precedent for that? I'm trying to think of a time before where a bill is in the legislative sausage making of Congress and the city has pulled it back. I'm not aware, on what authority can you take something back from Congress?
Well, there are two parts to that. First, is there precedent? I have not found precedent either. Second, the Home Rule Act is very clear that I transmit, and there is not a prohibition on my pulling it back.
Meaning a two-way street.
It simply says that the chairman shall transmit the legislation to Congress. And if you look at the intent behind the legislation, it is to prevent laws from going into effect without the opportunity for Congress to weigh in. So this law will not go into effect because I pulled it back.
We've got it. You can't take our legislation back.
Well, they haven't acted on it. And so
Just my question, I saw the president's tweet on this. The fact that the mayor basically says it's basically weak on crime. I mean, don't you think that influenced, maybe if not Republicans that you're talking about, but don't you think that influenced a lot of people?
yes,
So what's your view on that?
that it's inaccurate.
So you couldn't convince the mayor that, again, because you're talking about doing something to convince people. Obviously, the mayor is pretty close, to this situation.
I think our challenge here is that the messaging got out of our control, and that the messaging got picked up by Republicans who wanted to make a campaign out of it for next year against Democrats.
So does this, let's say, give the council pause in terms of overriding the mayor's vetoes on certain controversial items?
Absolutely not. And I think that this issue is unique in that the public conversation about public safety is always different than on any other important issues. Just is, as I said before, public safety, I don't know any other issue that lends itself to demagogic rhetoric the way public safety does.
So are you all going to try to work with the mayor as you craft this new crime code?
Of course, the legislative process should include all the stakeholders.
Means yes.
Mark,
I said that means yes.
you got my answer. Mark?
Well, I'll take another stab at this one. How much responsibility do you place on Mayor Bowser for opening? You said before this that Mayor Bowser was opening the door with her comments of it makes us less safe. How much blame do you think the mayor or responsibility do you think the mayor takes in this happening to this bill on the Hill and
Well,
with the president?
You know, I don't think I want to go there. The message today is that the bill's been pulled back from Congress. That's the message today. And I don't know that there's any purpose gained by getting into talking about what other folks did or didn't do or should or shouldn't have done.
So can I ask just logistically on this? You said that it's clear that you transmit. It doesn't, so I'm guessing what it is that home rule is actually silent on whether or not you can withdraw that. Is that correct?
That's correct. There isn't anything in the Home Rule Act that speaks to withdrawing.
So
And there, nothing, there's no prohibition on what I'm doing.
is there an advantage to the council and to your process by pulling it back rather than allowing the Senate? I mean, I know it stays in the headlines when I'm just wondering logistically, because if this becomes an issue like the non-voting citizen, you know, Senate says one thing, you interpret it a different way. Does it make it harder for you guys to come back at this? Does it make it easier for the council to address this if you pull it rather than having to go all the way to the president?
I think it makes it easier for us to work with the issue, having pulled it. And I think it also highlights that if the Republicans want to go forward, this doesn't have to do with the substance of the bill. This has to do with just scoring points nationally.
And then on the if I could go
I
back,
can't be clearer. My letter is quite clear. I've pulled back the bill. The Home Rule Act doesn't prohibit that. And the bill is not before Congress because it has to be transmitted to both houses. The Senate has not acted, and so therefore it's no longer before both houses, and therefore it's not properly for consideration. And that if the Republicans want to have a vote on Wednesday or Thursday, then they're voting on nothing.
and then could I ask about again,
But it does preserve our options.
just for clarification on the non-citizen voting, you still maintain that it has taken effect? Right.
Yeah, I hate the way you put it, but it's a fair way to put it. But I mean, we follow a process. The Secretary of the Council makes a point of transmitting bills only on days when both the House and Senate are in session. So there's no question that the count starts when both houses are in session. The law allows it if either house, but that's not when the count starts. And the law is quite clear. And I will quote, beginning on the day such act is transmitted by the chairman to the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate. Beginning on the day such act is transmitted. And it was transmitted, if I remember correctly, on January 10th, and the 30th day was something like February 23rd. I mean, that's just a count. That's what we've been doing for 40, 50 years. And there's no authority for counting starting on any other day. So the notice, which is not required, the notice that it is law, I've signed that already, and I believe it's published this week. No.
Chair Mendelson, Stephanie with Channel 5. I understand you spoke to how you still support the bill, but there are people in the district who are still very much against what was passed. What do you say to those folks who say that the council was not listening to DC residents?
What I say to them is that the council is not explaining very well to those folks. We've not explained as well as we need to what this bill does. And that is part of that's our fault. And that's part of what we have to fix.
And then the question was asked about the mayor, but we're talking about national headlines here on something very specific to the district. Who bears responsibility for how we got here?
Oh, again, not sure that I want to. I'll do a whole lot of finger pointing. I will say this, because I said it before. It's very clear to me that the folks who have been leading the charge against the legislation in Congress are not interested in what the bill says. That's very clear to me. Because when a congressman or a senator says this bill makes decriminalizes carjacking, they haven't read the bill. But that's not important for this issue. What's important for this issue is to try to put Democrats in the light of being soft on crime. And that's not what this bill does. So I said this before, to use carjacking again, what the law does is substantially more than what the typical sentences are. And the typical sentences here are actually greater than what the maximum is in other states. That's not soft on crime, but citizens don't understand that because the way this has been demagogued, and that's the challenge we have to overcome.
Chairman,
Yes,
so moving forward, obviously the biggest provision that was controversial, one of the biggest provisions over here.
No, I'm looking.
Oh, gosh.
Oh, that's where you are.
Thank you. Hi.
Your radio.
So,
So it doesn't matter where I'm looking.
oh, ouch. I've got a face for radio is what they say. All right. So basically the biggest controversy seemed to be around the reduction in penalties, maximum penalties for certain violent offenses. Now, in theory, let's say you've withdrawn this and the Senate actually accepts it.
In theory, no, I've withdrawn it, but go
Okay,
ahead.
fine. You've withdrawn it. Let's say in theory, the Senate accepts your
That's a
attempt.
theory.
Or even if they vote to withdraw, the point being revised criminal code is, dead in some form. You guys have to go back and probably rewrite the provisions that are most problematic regarding sentences for violent crimes. How do you do that with knowing that Republicans are going to hold the House for the next year and a half, potentially more? The Senate is also having an election. There's a presidential election coming up. I mean, do you call up to the Senate or the House every single time you're reconsidering a sentence and say, is 50 years enough for you guys, or do we want higher?
Well, I
is,
think that for some of the Republicans who've been leading the charge, it really doesn't matter. If we fix whatever issue they're bringing up, I think one of the issues was right to trial by jury, which just boggles my mind. So let's just say that we go back to the old law that individuals don't have a right to trial by jury in every criminal case, which, by the way, is the minority of the states. The Republican opponents will find something else. So I don't know how to answer your question because I don't think there's a clear answer. We're not going to touch base on every single provision. We're going to assess how we can improve the messaging and how we can, what's the best way to respond on the different points that have come up.
And just more broadly, kind of philosophically, are you now concerned? Does this raise new concerns for you about what the council can do on anything legislatively? I mean, if the idea is, and admittedly, you've always had Congress to worry about, but is there now a sense that everything that the council is going to vote on from this point on, you're going to have to do a gut check with Congress in mind? Like, will they raise complaints about X provision and try to overturn this, or do we?
Well, I don't plan on doing a gut check. Let's be clear. I don't plan on installing a hotline to the Republican leadership in the House and the Senate and calling them every week and asking for permission to move forward. No, I'm not going to do that. But does it raise a concern that there are going to be other issues? Yes. I think that concern was already raised when the House prevailed with its vote. And it's on us, that would be the mayor and my office, to strategize carefully on how we proceed if we perceive that there is something that could be made an issue for national purposes. And I will repeat, this is not about the substance of the bill itself. This is about using the district for national political purposes.
I'm trying to, thanks, Chairman. I'm trying to understand the mechanics of this process now. I mean, what's the letter that you sent today? Is it addressed to the, um, who is it addressed to
Addressed to
even?
the President of the Senate,
Okay. Can we get a copy of that too?
yes. So you may not be
And-
aware of this, but every bill that is approved by the council after it's signed by the mayor or veto, overridden, the veto, or not signed but returned, every bill, permanent bill before it becomes law, I transmit it to both houses. And there's a letter. Sometimes I transmit like 9 of them in one letter, and sometimes it's just one letter for one bill. And the letters are addressed to the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate. Back in January, we had to wait until there was a speaker before we could transmit any bill. That letter is signed by me. It's addressed to the Speaker, separate letter to the President of the Senate. And so this letter is addressed to the President of the Senate, withdrawing the transmittal.
And you haven't received a response yet.
No, we don't receive responses.
How do you literally withdraw a bill?
The
You-
same way.
It
that
makes
I
sense to
transmit.
transmit it, but how do you? I mean, are you confident they will respect this essentially? I mean, do you have to go to Congress?
Not confident that the Republicans will respect it.
The Senate's controlled by Democrats, so
Yes.
will they respect? I mean, I don't.
Well, as you know, as you just commented, the Senate's controlled by Democrats, I think by what, 2 votes? And we've seen how the Senate has had the comments that have come out of senators from both parties over the last week, the president's comment last week. So for their purposes, which has nothing to do with the substance of the bill, I'm not sure what their next step is going to be. But if they vote, they will be voting on nothing.
When did it occur to you that you could withdraw it?
I don't know how to answer that.
Like when did you realize I can just withdraw this bill? It's never happened before, as you said.
Yeah, well, when's the last time that when's the last time that the House voted against a bill? And then the Senate, counting votes, the Senate clearly is about to vote against the bill. When's the last time the president said that he would not veto this if it came to him? When's the last time that a DC bill was made to national talk shows? So, yes, Michael.
Chairman, I wanted to try to understand this a little bit more. So do you have the ability, if, for example, let's say a piece of legislation passed and went to Congress that you philosophically disagreed with compared to the rest of the council and the mayor, could you then go and pull that or withdraw that? Why not?
I think you have to look at the context here. And there are actually several things at work. So members know that I'm doing this. Every member opposes the House and the Senate overriding. The council's been quite clear about that. Most recently sending a letter maybe a week ago. I mean, so look at the context here. I'm not thwarting a bill that, members can say, hey, this would go through. You don't have, why are you blocking this bill when the House and the Senate are? I'm not blocking the bill. The Senate's made it clear that they're going to join the House and block the bill.
Okay, got it. And then when it comes to, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Oh, you said this has never happened before, at least you have never withdrawn a bill before. Has this
Correct.
ever happened in the history of the council?
I'm not aware. But I'm also not aware of a situation like this.
Mr. Chairman, this bill was sent up to the Hill with a unanimous vote, right? The override.
No, I believe it was 12.
12 to 1, sorry, 12 to 1. Does this point out a fundamental flaw? Who is the representative on the Hill that the council or on your staff who represents the legislature on Capitol Hill? The mayor has one person, I think, but the Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, of course, is the representative there, but she doesn't represent the council. Are you guys missing a step by not having someone who's on the Hill all the time, supporting your legislation?
We were missing a step, but I do have somebody on my staff now.
May I know who that is?
Yeah, John Kelvington is his name, and he's here.
Okay, there he is over the corner. Okay, thank you.
There were some complaints that some of the people who worked on the RCCA were more of liberal thinkers. Is there going to be any work to try and diversify the people who will be a part of it? I know there's the commission and the advisory group that, worked on it then.
The stakeholder group that worked on this, it was a commission. The commission actually was diverse. It had representatives from the U.S. Attorney's Office, the mayor's office, although I believe that person never showed. I don't remember all the different stakeholder groups. I think the Public Defender Service was on it.
What do you mean that
DC
person,
Attorney General was on it.
the person never showed,
Just what I said.
never a part of any of?
That's
the
my
work?
understanding. So, I mean, let me characterize it this way. There was staff that worked on the criminal code revision, worked on it for many, many years, like many, many years. But there also was a commission, and the commission was representatives of these different stakeholder groups. This was not a commission where I appoint 3 or 4 community representatives and the mayor appoints a bunch of community representatives. No, these were stakeholders. And these stakeholders, I mean, they know this stuff and they spend hours debating what the elements of arson are. And then how much of that do we put in the code? And what's the exact language? And what does this do in terms of jury instructions? And it really gets into a level of arcane detail. But these folks were all included. I would note, your question reminds me, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, and for those who don't know, we're the only jurisdiction where the United States Attorney prosecutes all local crimes except for low-level misdemeanors. The U.S. Attorney in October recommended that we go forward with the legislation that the Criminal Code Reform Commission had submitted to us, which is exactly what we did. Now, he at the same time said that he still had some concerns, and some of those concerns were addressed. I won't say all of them, but some of them were addressed. But he did, as a member of the commission, recommend that we go forward. So again, this just speaks to the misinformation around this. Like somehow a bunch of radical crazies in the community in the district came up with this bill that decriminalized all these offenses, and that nothing could be further from the truth. Well, as I said, the mayor had a representative on the commission, although person never showed up, and the chief of police, I can't remember if the chief was represented on the commission, but I would not characterize the chief as crazy, but he raised a number of concerns after the bill was submitted, and the council made a number of changes in response to his concerns. So, really the way to look at the bill is to compare it to what sentencing is today and what other states do. Decriminalizing is not a word that describes this bill. Misunderstood is a word that describes this bill. Yes, sir.
Last week, Councilmember Allen stated that if this bill goes down, it will open the door to, that it won't end here. That an active-minded Republican-held House will be basically looking for ways to interfere in DC affairs and possibly outright curb DC home rule. What is your level of concern that this experience will lead to further congressional interference?
Well, I said this before, I am concerned. I'm not going to make predictions, but I am concerned that Republicans who have seen that this can turn into a national issue and put the Democrats on the defensive will look for other opportunities with the district to do the same thing. I mean, that is the history of the District of Columbia, is 2 centuries of the district being used for national purposes, which for district residents is very unfair and offensive, which gets back to, that's a reason why I've pulled the bill back to try to settle this. Mark?
If I could shift to another topic.
Is there another topic?
Yeah. One, I'm wondering if you paid attention to the White House press briefing after the president said that he would.
It's the first question at the briefing, I think.
Right, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on, one, do you read into the statement of administrative policy what their position is on home rule? And you saw the press secretary repeatedly point to DC is not a state as the reason the president was doing this, but stop short of addressing home rule. I'm just wondering, you know, the White House won't talk about hypotheticals, so they won't say what would happen next time. But what are your concerns just about what the White House, we know what Congress's position is. What do you think the White House position on home rule is right now? Or do you have concerns about that based on the White House press briefing?
I think the White House's position is to protect the Democrats in Congress. That's what I think. And I think that's where this comes from. And I think that if we have hope for in the, whatever this is, the 21st century, is this the 21st century? Thank you. I get confused because it's 2000s. In the 21st century, the reality is that if we're to get statehood, it's going to be the Democrats who help us with it. Unfortunate, because statehood, it shouldn't be about partisan politics, but it has been. And so if we have any hope for statehood, we have to want to protect our Democratic friends in Congress. And that's where I think the president is.
And then can I ask about the CFO's recent projections and just that it seems to be what's hurting the district's bottom line are the empty office buildings downtown correct. And so I'm wondering, I know the mayor has been very vocal about wanting to call particularly the federal workforce back to their offices and as well the private sector. Have you taken a position on that? Have you called on the federal workers to come back to work? What is your position there as far as their impact on the tax revenue in DC and how they could help fix that if they would come back to work?
I have said numerous times that the federal workforce needs to come back.
Yeah, that's my next question, right? So if you want the federal workers to come back, what is the status of the people you're responsible for? I see most of the, if not all of the hearings are virtual now. You walk through this building, it's hard to run into a human being breathing. I know you come to work every day, sir, and I know some council members, but whose decision is that? You know, is that yours or is that left up to each individual council member what their office and their committees will do?
It's left up to each individual council member, but I believe that the different council members are reopening their offices. My office is open 4 days a week. Many of the folks in my office are in every day. So we're doing much better than the federal government. The district government is also, I believe, is 4 days a week.
So it's up to each individual council member what they do with both their staff and their committees?
Yes. Now, with
You don't
regard
have
to
any.
hearings, there's a
So
different issue.
before COVID happened, they could have just gone virtual if they wanted to, never showed up in the Wilson building?
Correct.
And you don't, what's your thought on that? I mean, what's your thought on,
Well,
what's your
personally,
guidance to your colleagues?
I think that I think folks should be in the office. The hearings is a different issue. Mark, the hearings is a question of access, so I don't view that as one of pandemic. How do I make it easiest for parents and teachers, for example, to testify at last week's education hearing? And my sense right now is having the hearing virtual for the public witnesses is easier and enables more folks to participate, and that's a good thing. So I think we're going to continue to see either virtual hearings or what we call hybrid hearings. My hearings last week, most of them, the government witnesses were required to show up in person. Juan is nodding his head like, yes, yeah, folks are in the chamber now. That's for the government, but the public. So that's different.
Virtual or, because my understanding is that at least some of the executive agencies have come before, have asked themselves that they would prefer to testify in person rather than doing it virtually.
I don't know.
And the committees have acquiesced to them.
I don't know. I can't speak. I can only speak for my experience, which is I told everybody they had to be in person.
Mr. Chairman, a big issue for people who are excited about having free buses in the summer you are having a dispute with the CFO. Every person I've spoken with and talked to about the legislation, the power of the CFO and his letter to the council says that he made the decision that the money you had planned on last December is not there now in February. You suggested he had misread the law or something, but everyone I've spoken to says the CFO has the authority to say whether the money's available or not, excess revenues over whatever that thing is, the money. Anyway, you don't have the money. Are you going to change the legislation to provide funding for the free buses? Or are you going to fight with the CFO or both?
The CFO is misreading the law. The law could not be clearer, and we wrote the law with the CFO staff, and it was clear what our intent was, which was, and the language in the law says specifically, and give me a second here, I'll find it for you. Says specifically, the reference in the law to the February revenue estimates is subsidiary. The February revenue estimates are reached only, quote, if necessary, unquote, and if the December revenue, quote, is not sufficient, unquote. There's nothing in the language of the law that talks about netting the two against each other, which is what the CFO did. There's nothing in the law that says anything about clawing back the December revenues. Let me be clear, because folks may not understand this. The council last fall passed legislation that beginning July 1st, bus service in the District of Columbia will be free. And this will particularly benefit low-income residents who are by far the ridership of our bus service. It benefits everybody, but it's very much an equitable measure on our part. We funded this out of revenue growth, out of excess revenues. We did not cut any program. I'm just making that clear because I'm expecting to hear rhetoric to the contrary. We funded this out of excess revenue that was not budgeted, that was not expected. We funded it out of the December revenue estimates, and if the December revenues were not adequate, if necessary, then go to the February revenue estimates. Somehow the CFO read into that the authority to net the two against each other, which is not what the law provides. He will not find that language, and in fact, he will find language that says quite clearly, if December pays for it, you certify that it's paid for, and that's it. End of discussion.
Said in his letter, certified that he could possibly change his mind in February.
Well, he can do anything he wants to, but it doesn't mean he has the authority.
Sounds like
on
you
this.
trying to get the bill pulled back from the Senate.
Very funny. Can I throw something at you? No, it's not analogous at all, because yeah. Correct. So the CFO is independent, and the CFO has undisputed authority over the city's finances, but he only to the extent allowed by law. So if we say, when we pass a budget, we say you have to spend money on this and no more, and money on this and no more, he can't go somewhere else. He has to follow the law. Yes, and he did in December. He certified that the money was there in December. And that's what the law said. Well, interesting. You must have talked with him. So that's interesting.
I read the letter.
Yes.
Simple declarative English
Yeah, and
sentence.
when I read that, what I understood was if the revenues drop, then we may have to look at this program or any other program.
You fund it in other ways if you don't have excess revenues, will you find money for the program?
Yes.
Okay.
But I hope the CFO didn't hear that, because the CFO is still on the hook in my book. Because he's misread it, and actually, to his credit, he is reevaluating his interpretation. Reevaluating might be the wrong word. Reviewing. Well, I'd like to say reconsidering, reviewing. I met with him last week. I brought more lawyers to the table than he did, and we discussed it, made our point quite clear, and he clearly is reviewing it. I want to say reevaluating it. That does not mean at this point he's agreed. But in my view, the law is very clear. And we could rewrite the law, but to what purpose? Because the law is already clear.
Buses will be free as of July.
Yes, July 1st.
Doesn't matter one way or the other. Buses will be free as of July.
Yes,
Metro has to Get everything done, though.
correct. Metro has to do
They're-
stuff. Whoa, changing subject.
Okay, so in regards, so all throughout the oversight hearings, we heard from constituents about lack of social services within the schools. We heard about certain schools not getting funded properly, all things that arguably can lead to more fighting within schools and situations where students' safeties are being jeopardized. Now, a couple years ago, the council unanimously voted to pull back SROs. Given
Correct.
everything that we heard about the other circumstances that create violence, why the change of heart? Why not embrace removing SROs in addition to bringing in the other wraparound services that can better accommodate young people?
Well, last year, actually, there was a vote on this. The mayor proposed and I supported reversing what the council had done the year before to phase out the SROs. And that vote failed 8-5 vote. Recently, I was at a meeting with that the mayor had with, gosh, close to 200 principals from public DCPS and charter schools. And overwhelmingly, the principals supported keeping the SROs. I think there's misunderstanding about the SROs, that the SROs are police who are stationed in individual schools, and the SROs are there for the purpose of maintaining order and arresting kids. And that's not what the SROs do here. I can't speak for other jurisdictions. The SROs here are assigned to multiple schools. They actually are invaluable eyes and ears to principals if there are incidents in the neighborhood. The principals rely on the SROs with regard to guidance when there's, let's say, a shooting near a school. What should happen to the school, lockdown, or hold the kids until the incident's been cleared. The school resource officers make very few arrests. Last year, with 50,000 kids in DCPS, my understanding is that there were 15 arrests of students on school grounds, 15. But of the 15, only half of them were made by SROs. Which brings up another issue, which is that the SROs are police officers, but they're especially trained to work with students and to understand policing in a educational setting. And it's really not so much policing as it is just, as I said before, eyes and ears for the principal. I would much rather have an SRO on the scene if there's an incident than an untrained MPD officer.
Saying differently though, they're saying that SROs are just as much police officers as MPD officers. So I'm
Well,
just
as a technical matter, yes, an SRO is a sworn MPD officer, but they've gotten the special training. So from the standpoint of training, no, they're not the same. And that's an important distinction, but also because I had a hearing out last week on public education issues and there was testimony about SROs. It's clear to me that folks who want to get rid of the SROs don't understand what our SROs are doing. For example, there was testimony about research, and I looked at the research, and the research talks about a kind of policing that's not what occurs with SROs here. As I said, the SROs are not stationed in an individual school. You don't walk into a school and there is the SRO sitting at the front desk. That's just not what happens.
So in terms of funding other services, given what we talked about with the revised estimates, revenue estimates, what does that look like in the new fiscal year? Just balancing all of that.
The mayor announced a 5% increase in the UPSFF. So the schools are going to be getting, public and DCPS are going to be getting more money. The council has already adopted legislation requiring that there be mental health professionals and nurses, which isn't directly on point, but is related in every school. We have funded that as well. And as you may know, I am in battle right now with the chancellor who is disregarding another law that requires that every school not be cut. And if the schools' budgets are held harmless, then schools will be able to keep their counselors and other folks who can deal with social emotional issues in the schools. So, I mean, I think all those resources are important, whether we're talking about mental health professionals or a full budget so that principals can have counselors if they think that is necessary or useful. But in addition, that the SROs are available to the principals.
To go back to criminal code, technically, so did you ask to withdraw the bill, or is your point of view that you have unilaterally said, I'm withdrawing the bill?
Did I ask to withdraw?
Yeah, I'm
No, I don't
asking.
ask.
Okay.
I don't ask to transmit. I
And-
transmit bills and I untransmitted this bill.
Okay, and because we don't have the letter yet, but and is this like, just to be explicit, is this a response to Joe Biden's statement last week? Would you have done this if the president hadn't said he wasn't going to veto the bill?
I'm not going to isolate that act. What's happened over the last week is that an increasing number of Democrats in the Senate have said that they either have not taken a position, which is never a good sign, or that they would be supporting the override. And then when the president said that he would not veto, to me, that says that probably more senators would join. Again, this is next year's campaign. That's what this is about. It's about getting, doing videos that say Senator so-and-so voted to be soft on crime in the District of Columbia. And nobody wants that as a message against them. I mean, I'm thinking what comes to mind immediately is Senator Blumenthal, who's a reasonable and friendly Democrat in the Senate, and he expressed reservations. So it's in response to all of that. Maybe one more question?
Just back to the criminal code, following up on that, even, okay, let's say the Senate doesn't go along with this, regardless of your insistence that you can untransmit something. Do plans remain the same otherwise in terms of taking up the bill again and kind of making changes to it if the Senate votes to overturn it and then it
Yeah.
actually gets overturned?
Yeah, as I said, I mean, none of the options that are available to us are great options. And none of them solve this problem. The problem being that we ought to be able to move forward with this bill. But our options are greater by withdrawing the bill. Let's do Mr. Rice and then you, and then we're done.
Would one possibility be for you to pass emergency legislation tomorrow negating the criminal code bill? That might be a clearer sign of what what you intend to do.
I'm not sure the votes are there.
Oh.
And that's an important point because this is not conceding to the Republican rhetoric that the bill is bad. It's simply pulling it back so that we have more options available to us, as well as reducing the heat, lowering the rhetoric, all that. This is not conceding that there are problems with the bill. If we were to vote tomorrow to repeal, the law is very clear that that would not, because that would be a temporary bill, that would not actually repeal the bill permanently. So it doesn't have effect.
So if I could just get some clarification on the free buses, because you kind of answered just yes or no questions. So what's going to happen come July with free buses? If the CFO stands firm that the money is not there, you said you would find it elsewhere. Can you remind us how much money it is per year? And then where would you find that money? How can you guarantee that this is going to go forward, given what the CFO has said thus far publicly?
Well, first of all, we had a very serious and frank meeting with the CFO last week with regard to the legal arguments. And the CFO agreed that he would look at the legal arguments. The council's position is clear that we support this legislation. If the CFO wrongly insists without the authority in the law, we have to deal with that reality. The amount of money that we're talking about is roughly $35 million for the free bus service and roughly another 8 million for the overnight routes, which is 12 routes. So that's about $43 million.
Right, so where would you find that money?
Where do we find any money?
That's a good question, but I mean, are you expecting to take it from the surplus? Or are you thinking of
Well, I'm
reprogramming?
expecting that the mayor will submit a budget that will be balanced. So there will not be excess revenue sitting around when she submits the budget. However, I also expect that the mayor will be increasing funding for different programs. And that's her choice, but that's a choice. But I don't know that I want to get too much into that. I'm quite clear that that the law is not on the CFO's side here. When we had the meeting, the CFO's attorney made his best case for why his interpretation was correct. And I personally looked at the statute in the light of his arguments, and I just don't see it. It's not there.
Isn't it a situation where the CFO says the money's not there? The money's not there.
He can only do that if he's within the law.
But if the money's not there,
No,
how do
the
you do
money,
it?
the money is there. How do I put this? You know, we have a $19 billion budget. It's not like we went from 19 million to 0 and the money's not there. It's 19. Is it 19 million and 19 billion, 40 million, or is it 19 billion? There's a lot of programs that we fund out of future revenues. I didn't say that quite right. When we adopt a budget, we pushed, I'm going to say, a couple $100 million from FY22 into 23, 24, 25, 26. What we did with the bus service is exactly the same thing. And the CFO has made a choice, which he doesn't have the authority to do. He doesn't have the authority to pick and choose programs, and he doesn't have the authority to misread a statute. The statute says that if the December revenues are there, he shall certify that the revenues are there and have been set aside. He doesn't have the authority to disregard that.
But we also, the mayor's office also says that part of the problem is funding is this $35 million is quite iffy. That you'll have to provide free metro access, which is very expensive. And you're not factoring that into the cost of this. And again, you don't have the money for this.
I'm not sure I understood all that. We have a fiscal impact on this, and we have a fiscal impact that was arrived by working with WMATA. So we know what the cost is. If the mayor is suggesting the cost is something different or more, she's making that up.
But she's making some.
If
but-
she's
but
saying that, then she's making that up. If you're saying
Even-
that,
even
then
if
you're
the
making
money-
it up.
Even if you don't even have an MOU, as I understand it, with DOT and Metro to do this until you get the money in place. Are you really confident whatever happens, you'll start free bus service on July 1st?
I would say I'm confident. Yeah. I'm being told to wrap this up.
Chairman, real quick before you do, can you please help me understand why you have more options withdrawing this rather than letting it just go through the process in the Senate regardless? I don't.
Because
understand.
that's always, I mean, that's something I say with the experience of being a legislator. I mean, it's analogous to when I move an amendment and I see the votes aren't there and I withdraw the amendment and I say, I'll bring it back in 2 weeks. I'm not saying we'll bring this back in 2 weeks, but I say I'll bring it back. You know, the conversations, or I rethink the language, I make some tweaks. In this case, maybe do better messaging, maybe just sit back for a while. Maybe have the committee take it up with a new report. There are all kinds of possibilities. And that's typical in the legislative process. If you just simply go to a vote and the vote and I expect that the vote is going to not be close, then it just becomes harder to overcome that. It just does. It's optics, but it's also, maybe it's optics, but it's within the optics, the ability, the flexibility to find a path forward. We have to revise the criminal code. Our criminal code is one of the worst in the country. We have to revise it. And our options are better by pulling the bill. And if the Republicans choose to go ahead with a hollow vote, that's their choice. Thank you all very much.